From the charge of the Light Brigade to the Bengal Famine to the Munich Agreement, these are 7 times Britain got it completely wrong. 7 decisions so catastrophic they reshaped borders, toppled governments, and cost millions of lives. From Victorian cavalry charges into certain death to imperial famines fueled by racist indifference, this is the story of an empire that kept making the same kinds of mistakes and somehow kept going. Start with the most romantically disastrous military blunder ever committed. October 25th, 1854. The Crimean War, the Battle of Balaclava. In the reign of Queen Victoria, Commander Lord Raglan, perched on high ground overlooking the battlefield, sent an order to the Light Brigade: disrupt the movement of Russian artillery. Simple enough, except that the officer who carried that order down and delivered it to Lord Cardigan, the Earl of Cardigan, who actually led the charge, gestured vaguely toward the wrong guns, and just like that, 673 cavalrymen charged straight into a valley surrounded by Russian artillery on 3 sides. They rode 1.5 miles into what Tennyson would later call the mouth of hell. Russian guns tore into them from the front, from the left, from the right. When it was over, 278 men were casualties, over 475 horses were dead, and nothing whatsoever had been achieved. French General Bosquet, watching from a nearby ridge, said what everyone was thinking: "It is magnificent, but it is not war." A catastrophic blunder born from the fog of war and incompetent senior commanders, and yet Victorian Britain somehow turned it into a legend of courage rather than a cautionary tale about communication. Now jump forward 60 years. The First World War has ground to a bloody stalemate on the Western Front, and Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, has a bold idea: attack Constantinople, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war entirely, open a new front through the Dardanelles. It sounded brilliant on paper. On the beaches of Gallipoli, it was anything but. The campaign launched in April 1915, and from the very first landings, everything unraveled. The forces committed were simply not enough. Intelligence on the terrain was virtually non-existent. Many of the commanders were as inexperienced as the soldiers they were leading, and the Ottoman defenders, far from the pushover the British expected, fought with ferocious determination. Among the Allied troops who bore the worst of it were the Anzac forces, Australian and New Zealand soldiers, whose losses at Gallipoli became so defining that April 25th is still commemorated as Anzac Day across the Pacific. For 9 agonizing months, Allied troops clung to narrow beachheads, gaining almost no ground. Of the estimated 213,000 British casualties, an astonishing 145,000 came from disease alone: dysentery, typhoid, frostbite. The total death toll reached over 130,000 on both sides. Churchill resigned. His reputation wouldn't recover for decades. And here's the darkest irony: the evacuation itself was flawless. Over 80,000 troops were withdrawn without a single fatality. The Turks didn't even realize the beaches were empty until they attacked and found no one there. Britain couldn't win the battle, but it could certainly sneak away from one. Speaking of Churchill, there's something he left out of his 6-volume wartime autobiography entirely. In 1943, while Britain fought for survival against Nazi Germany, 3 million people starved to death in Bengal under the administration of the British Raj. Britain's own declassified records show that Churchill was repeatedly informed, repeatedly asked for food shipments, and repeatedly refused. Recent studies confirmed that the Bengal famine wasn't caused by drought. Rainfall that year was actually above average. It was, according to researchers, a complete policy failure. Rice supplies were diverted for military use. Exports continued out of the region. And when his own cabinet urged him to act, Churchill responded by saying the famine was the Indians' own fault for breeding like rabbits. Between 2 and 3 million people died. It remains one of the most devastating famines in recorded history, and in Churchill's own memoir, it doesn't merit a single page. If the Bengal Famine revealed Britain's callousness at the height of empire, the Suez Crisis exposed the moment that empire finally crumbled. In 1956, Egyptian President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain, France, and Israel hatched what can only be described as a breathtakingly cynical plan. Israel would invade the Sinai, then Britain and France would swoop in as supposed peacekeepers, issuing an ultimatum they knew Egypt would refuse, giving them the pretext to seize the canal by force. The military operation actually worked, but everything else collapsed. President Eisenhower was furious that the invasion happened without American knowledge. He pressured the International Monetary Fund to deny Britain financial assistance. The pound hemorrhaged value, tens of millions drained from Britain's reserves in a single week. The whole thing lasted 2 days before Britain was forced into a humiliating withdrawal. Prime Minister Anthony Eden's career was destroyed. Historians now point to Suez as the moment the British Empire effectively ended. Empires don't always fall when they lose wars. They fall when they lose the ability to decide. But no British mistake left a deeper human scar than the partition of India in 1947. When Britain finally decided to leave the British Raj, Lord Mountbatten was given until June 1948 to manage the transition. Impatient to return home and advance his naval career, he moved the date up by 10 months to August 1947. The new borders were drawn by a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never set foot in India, relied on outdated maps and census data, and had just weeks to carve a subcontinent in two. Leaders who had spent years negotiating the terms of independence, Jawaharlal Nehru for India and Muhammad Ali Jinnah for Pakistan, were handed borders drawn by a man who'd never walked the land he was dividing. Prime Minister Clement Attlee, back in London, approved the timeline with barely a second glance. The result was the largest forced migration in human history. Between 12 and 20 million people were displaced. Communal violence erupted on an unimaginable scale. Over 1 million people were slaughtered, and untold numbers were maimed and mutilated. Throughout it all, British soldiers were confined to their barracks, ordered by Mountbatten to protect only British lives. Radcliffe never returned to India. Shortly before his death in 1977, he told a journalist, "I suspect they'd shoot me out of hand, both sides." Closer to home, Britain managed a spectacular domestic blunder in 1990. Margaret Thatcher introduced the community charge, better known as the poll tax, replacing property-based local taxes with a flat per-person charge. In practice, this meant a millionaire living alone in a mansion would pay less than an average working family. On March 31st, 1990, 200,000 people marched through central London. The protest turned into one of the worst riots the city had seen in a century, with 113 people injured and 339 arrested. Within months, Thatcher was forced to resign. The tax was abolished the following year, and it remains a textbook example of how ignoring basic fairness in policy design can bring down even the most dominant political leader. And finally, the mistake that cast the longest shadow before the Second World War even began. In September 1938, Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich and signed an agreement handing Hitler the Sudetenland, a fortified border region of Czechoslovakia, without Czechoslovakia even being consulted. The Sudetenland wasn't just territory, it was the country's entire western defensive line. Chamberlain returned home waving the agreement and declaring peace for our time. Churchill, then a backbencher with no power, called it an unmitigated disaster. 6 months later, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. 6 months after that, he invaded Poland, and the world was at war. Appeasement didn't prevent conflict. It guaranteed it, on far worse terms, and the word itself became permanently synonymous with dangerous weakness in the face of aggression. 7 mistakes, 7 moments where overconfidence, prejudice, impatience, or sheer incompetence produced catastrophe. From a misunderstood cavalry order in 1854 to a signed agreement in Munich in 1938, the thread running through all of them is remarkably consistent. A refusal to see the world as it actually was, rather than as Britain wished it to be. The cavalry charge that became a poem. The famine erased from a memoir. The empire that fell not in battle, but in a currency crisis. Britain has been, as one historian put it, mucking up and carrying on regardless for centuries. The carrying on is admirable. The mucking up, though, is worth remembering, because the cost was rarely paid by the people who made the decisions.